The focus of this lecture will be on slavery and how it affected westward expansion and the argument over slavery. So after the Mexican-American War, this acquisition of a lot of land had just happened, and so there was all this new land, and we now again all of the fighting and tension over slavery that we thought we had left behind with the Missouri Compromise is coming up again. And so the people were really looking for a compromise. How can we make this happen? And added on to a war appropriations bill, a bill about money and war. Added on by David Wilmot was the Wilmot Proviso. And this said that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in the newly gained territory. Now, he was able to push it through the House of Representatives, but of course the Senate, where there was equal representation, it wouldn't go through, or they wouldn't put it through. And so the Southerners were very angry about this. They were angry about the idea of it, and they said, you know what, this kind of thinking and these ideas, even though the Wilmot Proviso didn't go through, it will threaten slavery absolutely everywhere. And Congress really has no right to ban slavery in this territory that is collectively owned by the states. All of the states own it, not just the federal government, and so slavery should not be banned throughout it. And so South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun said, or in one of his quotes, he said that it would cause political revolution, anarchy, and civil war might even follow if this Wilmot Proviso were to be pushed through. And so, obviously this wasn't the compromise that they were looking for. And one man named Lewis Cass, this is a picture of him right here, he came up with a plan to try and make it so that they don't have to keep fighting about it. Congress is just constantly fighting about what to do with these states. And he said we should use popular sovereignty, the idea that every single citizens of each territory should get to decide on whether their territory is going to allow slavery or ban it within their borders. So then came in the election of 1848, and the election of 1848 ended up turning into almost a three-party election. And so what ended up happening is the Whigs chose their candidate as Zachary Taylor. He was a war hero, and in general, he didn't want to make anybody upset. And so he pretty much fully avoided the issue of slavery. He just didn't talk about it and wouldn't bring it up. And so, people in the South, people in the North, both equally were kind of for him because he just wouldn't talk about it. Lewis Cass, he was the Democrat candidate for president. We know he believed in popular sovereignty. It was his idea that he had brought forth. And so he supported that popular sovereignty. Now, it was kind of interesting, though, because when he would campaign in the South, he never mentioned his popular sovereignty, but he did mention that he would veto the Wilmot Proviso if Congress ever was able to push it through, because he believed they should be able to choose. But then in the North, he would talk about popular sovereignty and the choice of the new territories, that they should get to choose whether they have slavery or not, which was very popular in the North. And then Martin Van Buren was a former president we know about who ran with the new party that had been made of a bunch of other people that had left their parties, called the Free Soil Party. And what happened is the Northern Democrats, who were upset about popular sovereignty and wanted slavery to be outlawed by the government, they had left and joined this party, and they had gotten together with a group of people, a group of Whigs known as the Conscience Whigs. And the Conscience Whigs were Whigs from the North who were worried that Taylor supported slavery, and they didn't want that to happen. And so they had broken off from the party to join this Free Soil Party. Also, Liberty Party members who were a previous abolitionist party trying to get rid of slavery, joined in too. And so these three groups joined in, and they were against slavery, Free Soil Party. And so the Free Soilers did not win, but they were able to split the Democratic vote, especially in New York, enough that that Zachary Taylor and the Whigs won New York for the first time in a long time. And so Zachary Taylor was able to become the 12th president of the United States. So California, way out on the edge, was pretty rural, like we talked about. But in 1848, gold was found in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and so tons of people started to head out there. 80,000, what we call 49ers, came out to look for gold. People that rushed out during the gold rush to try and find gold and become rich. And so that meant they had enough population that California could apply to become a state. And again, now that we have this new state coming up, we have the argument over slavery or free state. And so President Taylor didn't want the argument happening in Congress. And so he wanted the state to decide and apply to be one of those two. And so they decided and talked about it, and they applied to be a free state in 1849. Now, this is a problem because this would mean that if California is let in as a free state, then there will now be less slave states than there are free states. And the South was worried that this might limit slavery as well as their states' rights that they were worried about. And so the leaders of the South started to speak openly about this idea of secession. This is the first time we're going to hear secede, seceding, secession. Guys, secession is just withdrawing from the Union. So they wanted to break themselves off from the rest of the country and become their own country. So no longer be part of the United States because they felt they were being persecuted by their slavery decisions. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint number 1. So Henry Clay came in again. He's known as the Great Compromiser for a reason, from Kentucky, and started putting together a compromise that would help settle down this speaking of secession and all of that. And so the Compromise of 1850 was built, and his proposal had these sets of compromises where there'd be each side would get a little bit of something. So the first one was California would be admitted as a free state, but there would be no restrictions on the whole rest of all the new land that they had gotten from the Mexican cession. And so no more restrictions on any of that kind of gold and yellow territory that's there. The second part was that New Mexico and Texas border disputes would go in favor of New Mexico. So New Mexico would get more land out of that, but the government will take on Texas's debt and pay it off. So the federal government will pay off Texas's debt. The third piece would be that slave trade would be illegal in Washington, D.C., so you could not buy or sell slaves, but that slavery would still be legal. The fourth one is that Congress would not be able to interfere with and change interstate slave trade, so between states they should be allowed to, and then they would make a stronger Fugitive Slave Act, which we'll talk about a little bit later on the next slide. Now, this didn't pass through right away. It didn't pass through because Zachary Taylor, the president, was against it, and so he was not supporting it, so it didn't get through Congress. But then he died suddenly, and his vice president took over, Millard Fillmore, and Millard Fillmore, the 13th president, was for the compromise. He thought it was a good way to end this argument forever. And so it hadn't gone through already. There were already problems with it, but Stephen Douglas, representative out of Illinois that we're going to talk a lot about in the next a couple of lectures, really took charge and took all of these ideas, the same ideas, and broke them up into smaller bills that could all be voted on individually so that people could vote against the ones they didn't like and for the ones that they liked. But because of this, all of the parts of the original proposal were adopted. So the entire Compromise of 1850 was adopted. It was just adopted a small piece at a time. Probably the most impactful part of that compromise was the Fugitive Slave Act. And so we look at the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and this was a really big deal. This had a big effect because it was really a win for the South, but it ended up kind of hurting their overall cause. And so what happened in the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is they said that any African American could be accused of being a runaway and captured. Okay, and the way that this would work is you could just say that person is a runaway and capture them, and then a federal commissioner, like a judge kind of a thing, would decide on the case. But the African American because of the rules that we had in place, were not allowed to testify in court. So they couldn't come in and defend themselves or say anything, right? And on top of that, the weird thing is the commissioner received a $10 fee, so they got $10 for their work if they sided with the slaveholder, and only $5, half as much, if they sided with the slave. So it was kind of set up to get those slaves or those African Americans back into slavery, even if they hadn't ever been into slavery or had bought their way out or whatever. The second part of the law is if you're a northerner or whoever you are, if you don't actively help a slave catcher who's trying to catch somebody, you could be put in jail. And so what did this end up doing? It really ended up hurting the Southern cause because it made the Northerners very angry that they were required to help. Most of them didn't care that much about slavery and didn't have a strong opinion, but they were angry that they were required to help out. And it started to make them take action against slavery. And one of the big actions was maybe to vote against slavery. And so this kind of brought up that now, okay, slavery is a problem. It's affecting me, a non-slave owner in the North. And so now I have to take action on it. Other people that were more active in slavery were the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a group of people who helped thousands of people escape slavery. It wasn't really underground. It wasn't a tunnel. It wasn't really a railroad. It was just a group of people who helped escape slaves from the South get up to the North or up to Canada. And so the members were known as conductors that helped those slaves escape to the North or to Canada. And one of the most famous conductors was this woman, Harriet Tubman. She was an escaped slave herself, and so she took a ton of risk. Every time she went back down and got another group of people to help them out, she was risking herself because she could get caught as a fugitive slave herself and put back into slavery. And so she took a huge risk. And then also Levi Coffin was another one. He was one of the most famous station masters. So that would be, he's a Quaker and an abolitionist. And so what he would do is he would open up his house and allow people to hide out there of the stops as one of the stops in their escape route of the Underground Railroad. And so it's thought that he and his family hid and protected around 3,300 African Americans during their escapes to the North. Take a moment to write out your answer to checkpoint number 2. Another thing that brought the northern people to start, caring more about slavery and taking action on it was kind of making it a human problem instead of a political fight. And so Uncle Tom's Cabin did a lot towards that. This was by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who had previously been a slave, and she just was an excellent writer. And so she decided to write a book, essentially. It was actually started out as a series in a newspaper and later became a book, but she wrote out a fictional story to show the evils of slavery and the terrible things that were happening in slavery. And so what it did is it changed that idea of how the North saw slavery. It went from this political fight about some concept to a real problem, a real human problem of humans are dealing with this terrible stuff and we need to stop it to help them. And so obviously this made people in the South angry. The South tried to have the book completely banned and taken off of shelves everywhere in America, but they were not successful. And this started to move more and more people in the North to action against slavery. So the people of America wanted to continue to move west, and they wanted to do that quickly and develop quickly. And so the idea was to build a railroad, a transcontinental railroad. Transcontinental just means going all the way across the entire continent. So the Transcontinental Railroad was a railroad going all the way across the continent. And the idea was any of the areas that were connected, it would really help out development and allow it to move very, very quickly. And so they thought, well, there's basically two possible routes that we can go because we're already connected to New Orleans and we're already connected to Chicago with our current railroads. So railroads were already running out here to New Orleans and are already running here to Chicago. And so we can essentially go on the north side from there out to California, and that would be our kind of north route of the Intercontinental Railroad. Otherwise, we could go with this southern route, okay, and that would be the Southern Intercontinental Railroad that went through New Orleans, and it went through actually the northern part of Mexico. And so Jefferson Davis, who was the Secretary of War, he was from the South, he convinced the president to buy a strip of land, not a very big strip of land, just kind of like right here, okay, from Mexico. And so they bought for $10 million, they bought this 30,000 mile strip of land so that they could run a railroad through it. Okay. And that's kind of the last purchase, if we're not talking about Alaska and Hawaii, that finished out what would be the continental United States, anyways. But Gadsden Purchase was made, and those two railroads started to move. And so Stephen Douglas knew that, because he was from Illinois, remember, he knew and supported the northern route, and he knew that if they were going to really push that route, then the land to the west of Missouri and Iowa really needed to be organized and needed to be set up in a way that would help the government make these moves and make it easier for the companies that are trying to build the railroads. And so he proposed a bill to make that land to the west of Missouri and Iowa into the territory of Nebraska. The Southerners said, we're not going to accept this. We don't want a new one because that's above the Missouri Compromise line, and that would be free states. Eventually, it would turn into free states, and we don't want to deal with that. And so they said, we will accept it and let you do that territory of Nebraska, but you have to then repeal the Missouri Compromise. So we have to get rid of that so that we don't have this slave or these states as free states necessarily. Okay, so Nebraska and Kansas came to be from this idea. All right, and so basically what they did is it was put together. It was this Kansas-Nebraska Act was put together by Stephen Douglas and passed in May of 1854, and it repealed the Missouri Compromise. So now this black line that's here that was supposed to be above that isn't free, and below that can be a slave. Okay, that's gone now. And it opened up two brand new territories. It opened up Nebraska, which lined up next to the non-slave state of Iowa. This whole area is kind of the Nebraska territory. Okay, and then the other territory is the Kansas territory, which lined up with the slave state of Missouri. Okay, and so really people thought, okay, now this will open up one free state, possibly, and one slave state. We can kind of keep it even with Nebraska and Kansas. But it made a lot of anti-slave people angry because this whole area was supposed to be free land and not slave land, and so that was very frustrating to them. And so Kansas came to be, and very soon after, Bleeding Kansas happened. It's known as Bleeding Kansas. So what happened is, before the Kansas could become a state, they had to get a certain amount of population. And so lots of people from the north who were abolitionists, who were anti-slave, started to rush into Kansas to get a majority and try and become a free state, because they would get to choose that as they're deciding. And a bunch of people from Missouri started to run across into the state, and they even came across and illegally voted in Kansas, and they ended up getting a pro-slavery legislature. So when the vote came through and they created their government, it was pro-slavery because so many people had come from Missouri across the border and illegally voted for pro-slavery people. And so the anti-slavery people said, nope, we don't recognize that government. That's not legitimate. And so they created their own government. So now in Kansas, there were two whole separate governments that were set up, and neither one of them recognized that the other one should. And so now the Missourians were frustrated by this because the anti-slavery government was the one that was being recognized by the federal government, and so they attacked. Some of the Missourians came in and attacked the ones that had voted illegally, and a territorial civil war began where 200 people would die during this conflict in Kansas, and about $2 million in property was damaged during this time, all over this fight to be a free state versus a slave state, because Kansas was intended to be a slave state, but their people wanted to be free. And the regular people weren't just fighting. This fight had gotten so bad that people were physically attacking each other, even in the House of Government. There was an attack in Senate. And so Charles Sumner was a Massachusetts senator, a very strong abolitionist, and he gave a very strongly worded speech. And he gave his speech saying that Kansas was being forced into slavery, and said, or had all of these attacks on Andrew Butler of South Carolina. Okay, and just not actually attacking him, but attacking his character, and saying bad things about him in his speech. Preston Brooks came in the next day and said, "You know what? This speech that I heard about was an attack on my family member, who was Andrew Butler." Okay, he said, "This is an attack on my family member and on my state of South Carolina." And he actually got up, grabbed his cane, and started to beat Charles Sumner with a cane. Beat him and beat him and beat him in the middle of Congress, okay, and left him severely injured. All right, there were people that were just taken aback by it. And the North thought the Southerners were barbaric, and I can't believe you're doing this. And people in the South were supporting of him, and they sent Preston Brooks canes in the mail and things like that to show their support. So it shows you this fight was getting worse and worse and worse as time went by. Write out 3 questions you have from the notes so far. If you have no questions, then create 3 test questions you might see on a quiz or a test from this material.